Thank you, Acting President. I will be brief. I am not an enthusiastic supporter of many of the symbolic acts of acknowledgement of Indigenous Australians that we've adopted over recent years. I sometimes roll my eyes at ceremonies that have become de facto compulsory for almost everyone in public life who wants to signal their virtue on Indigenous issues. Symbolism that by and large has no real value. I am sceptical of a lot of the symbolic things, but I am not an enemy of reconciliation. So, unlike the usual virtue signalling, this bill is potentially something more than symbolic. A treaty authority that will, ultimately, sign a treaty with the Victorian government. But I have concerns. Treaties can only be signed between sovereign powers. To be blunt, I'm not sure that either Indigenous groups or the Victorian government have the necessary sovereignty to enter into such a treaty. Victoria passed much of its sovereignty onto the federal government in 1901. It's unlikely that it really has the power by itself to treat with a separate sovereign power. On the Indigenous side, we often hear that sovereignty was never ceded. So, Indigenous Victorian groups claim a residual power to treat. However, either the ultimate end of such a treaty would be to cede this residual authority to the Victorian government, or it will result in the creation of separate territories outside the power of the Victorian state. Much of what the Victorian government has put in place, supposedly for the benefit of Indigenous Victorians, is largely a sham. Title is given over areas of Crown land, but not really. Instead of freehold land belonging to the people and free for them to choose how to use it, it is some kind of symbolic title where the government retains control and directs use, and mismanages into destruction. Now, I've often stood in this place and advocated for the creation of a separate state from the regional parts of Victoria, free from the hegemony of Melbourne and the urban voters. But I struggle to see how we can create separate sovereign Indigenous territories from the remnants of Crown land in the regions in this state. At best, we will produce South African apartheid-style homelands, economically dependent client states keeping Indigenous people begging governments for funding. As a representative from regional Victoria, I've said before that regional communities bear most of the costs of the city's reconciliation program. The inner city gets the warm, fuzzy feelings, and the regional people get excluded from land and have their lifestyles and their events shut down. To be clear, I'm not opposed to reaching a settlement with Indigenous Victorians. I'm willing to entertain many things towards this end, even radical things. Changing dates and holidays, handing over freehold title to areas of Crown land, arriving at a final dollar sum of compensation, establishing an Indigenous electoral roll as they have in New Zealand. All those things would be on the table as part of the process for creating a new state of Murray, if that ever goes ahead. But I'm not prepared to sell out regional Victorians for the feelings of inner city Melbourne. To have non-Indigenous regional Victorians excluded from the land and their lifestyles to push a city-based reconciliation process. City-based Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who benefit, not regional Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I'm happy to hand over freehold title to Lake Tyrrell to Indigenous ownership, including revenue streams from tourism and salt extraction, provided the rights of the local non-Indigenous groups are respected, the rights to their rally 3 days a year. But all agreements we make must be with the consent of the people of regional Victoria. And I'm not prepared to participate in an ongoing, open-ended series of concessions where each time the ground is conceded, the goalposts move further. There remains an open source surrounding the settlement of Indigenous issues in Victoria and Australia, and it needs to be closed. But the solutions need to be for all Victorians and all Australians. We need a deadline to finalise discussion, we need clear limits on what's on the table, we need costs at not arriving at a settlement, and we need to really establish who has the sovereignty to negotiate. All of which could be achieved from a treaty authority, but will not be achieved from this authority or from this bill.